Yo, what up? It's Darius, and welcome back to the SQL Server Series. In our last video, we talked about how to use the group by and having clause. We used aggregate functions to perform calculations, and we grouped our rows of the result set based on one or more columns. Then we added search conditions to filter our result sets with the having clause. So in this video, we're going to begin learning how to code subqueries. A subquery is a select statement that's coded within another select statement. You can use subqueries to build queries that would be difficult or impossible to do in other means. So the real trick to using subqueries is to know where and when to use them. So to eliminate confusion, let's take a look at some examples. There are four ways to introduce a subquery in a select statement. The first way is in a where clause. The second way is using the having clause as a search condition. The third way is in the from clause as a table specification. And then the fourth way you can use it is in the select clause as a column specification. So I'm going to list them out here in our query window so we can see them. And like I said, the first way you can introduce a subquery in a select statement is in a where clause as a search condition. The second way is in a having clause as a search condition. The third way is in the from clause as a table specification. And the fourth way is using the select clause as a column specification. So now that we have that here and we can see it, so I'm going to write a query that gets the invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total from our invoices table, but only where the vendor ID comes from the vendors table, where our vendor state is California. So I'm going to start by selecting the invoice number. Then I'm going to get my invoice date and my invoice total. And then that's going to come from the invoices table, like I just said. And then since we're using a subquery, I'm gonna first use the where clause as a search condition, which we have up here, which is the first way we can use it. And I'm gonna say where vendor ID is in, and then I'm gonna open up two parentheses here. This is the beginning of my subquery. Then inside these parentheses, I'm going to include another select statement, and that's going to be where the vendor ID is in, select the vendor ID. I'm getting the vendor ID column from our vendors table, where the vendor state is equal to California. And then I'm going to order by invoice date. And we're going to run this. We're going to run this query. You see here now we have our invoice number, our invoice date, and our invoice total from our invoices table. But we only got those rows and records where the vendor ID came from our vendors table that had the state of California. So that's how you use a subquery where the where clause is a search condition. Now, there's another way we can also write this query, and we can write this query using a join. So to rewrite this query, I could select the invoice number, the invoice date, the invoice total, and that can come from the invoices table. And then I can join in the vendors table, right? I could join it on the invoices.vendor ID is equal to vendors.vendor ID using an inner join. And then I could just say where vendor state is equal to California, and then I can order by invoice date, and this will get us the same exact result set. Why will it get us the same exact result set? Well, when you're using the subquery, what you're doing is in your where clause, the column that you're checking against is checking to see if it matches with the column from the other table that you're subquerying in with the other select statement. And when you're doing a join, you're doing pretty much the same thing. And with the inner join is you're matching the primary key to the foreign key. Now when using a subquery in the where clause and in the having clause, there are other operators that you can use instead of the in operator. You can use comparison operators like greater than, less than, or less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. You can also use the all keyword to test that a comparison condition is true for all of the values that are returned by your subquery. But the all keyword is typically used, within comparison operators like the greater than, the less than, and less than or equal to, and the greater than and equal to. So let's look at a query that uses the all keyword in our comparison operators. And I'm gonna write a query that returns invoices larger than the largest invoices for our vendors, and it's going to be targeted towards vendor ID 34. And we're going to use the all keyword with our comparison operator of the greater than sign to say, hey, we want the invoice total that's greater than 34 from the invoices table, where vendor ID is equal to 34. So I'm going to select the vendor name. Then I'm going to get my invoice number. And I'm going to get my invoice total. And that's going to come from the invoices table. And then I'm going to join in vendors. And I'm going to do that on invoices.vendor_id is equal to vendors.vendor_id. And then now here's where the all keyword comes in with the comparison operator. And then I'm going to say, hey, where invoice total is greater than all, then I'm going to select the invoice total from invoices where the vendor ID is equal to 34. And to finalize my query, I'm going to order by vendor name. I'm going to run this query. And you see here we have our vendor name, our invoice number, and our invoice total from our invoices table. We've joined in our vendors table on vendor ID using the inner join. And then we only wanted our invoice totals that were greater than the invoices that have a vendor ID of equal to 34. You can also use the any keyword to test that a condition is true for one or more of the values that are returned by your subquery. So I could take this query, I could rewrite it, or I could copy and paste it, and I could change our keyword out from all, and I could just use any. And then I could say where invoice total is less than any invoices that have a vendor ID of, let's say, 115. So it's going to give us our vendor name from our vendors table, the invoice number, and the invoices total, where the invoice total is less than any invoice total from our invoices table that have a vendor ID of 115. So I can run this query and see here's our result sets. So to break this down to make it more simple, if I run my subquery select statement here separately, you see we have 4 rows here. For invoice total, we have 6.00 for 3 of them, and then we have 25.67 for one of them here. And so this is saying where the invoice total is less than any of these. So it would have to be less than any of these where the vendor ID is equal to 115 in order for us to get that result set. And that is exactly, oops, I almost opened up another query window there, and that is exactly what it did for us. Another one you can use is the exists operator to test that one or more rows are returned by the subquery. And if what is inside the subquery does not exist, then it will not be returned. or if it does exist, then it will be returned based on how you write your query. So for a quick example, I could select my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor state from my vendors table. And then I could say where not exists. And then inside this subquery, I can say I could select all from invoices where invoices.vendor ID is equal to vendors.vendor ID. So this is going to give me the vendor ID, the vendor name, and the vendor state from our vendors table that does not have any invoices where the invoices.vendor ID is equal to the vendors.vendor ID. If I run this query, this is our result set. So in our next video, we're going to learn how to use the subquery in the from clause as a table specification, and then we're going to learn how to use it in the select as a column specification. So we are going to break this video series down into two parts on how to code subqueries. So if you're interested in watching, please head on over to database-tutorials.com. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you disliked it, please go ahead and hit that thumbs down button. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and see you next time.